Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute. My name is John Linchowski. I'm president of the Institute, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. I've been an admirer of Paul Kengor for many, many years. He is one of the most outstanding historians and analysts of the Cold War, the Reagan administration, and he's one of those who understands the Cold War not simply in materialistic terms, but in terms of some of its other some of its more deep dimensions, including the war of information, the war of ideas, and the underlying moral conflict which it represents. Paul is professor at Grove City College, professor of political science. He is the executive director of its Center for Vision and Values, which, if you don't know, it has an email list or a blog. I don't know what you exactly call it, but I get all of the emails, and I think they're outstanding. Paul is also a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He has written so many books, I can't count them all. They're all outstanding, and I'm not going to waste your time anymore except to say that I'm delighted that you're here, Paul. You are rendering the cause of American national security and the protection of our civilization a great service by your scholarly work, and so I thank you for this. We owe you all a debt of great gratitude. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, John. It's too kind, and definitely too kind. As Bill Clark used to say, who John worked for, you're easily deceived. You're easily deceived. And speaking of which, I'm going to embarrass him, but Bill Clark's son, Colin Clark, is here today, and Colin just happened to be in town. Got our email on this last night, and so flew in from Colorado, I guess, right?
Yeah, Midway. I think that the email went Midway, and so we'll tomorrow afternoon, and we'll stop up.
So really, really great to have him here.
May I just interrupt?
Yeah, please.
Colin, I've got a picture of your father and the president up there on the "I Love Me" wall, and I'd love you to see it. So thanks for being here. No problem. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, but no, I've been an admirer of this place for a long time. I send my students here. I recommend it to my students. And I think the last time that I was here, I'm guessing the book Dupes came out in about 2010. And it must have been around 2007, 2008. And I was sitting right over there somewhere by that bookshelf in the corner with Herb Romerstein. And it was Herb that I dedicated this book to. Herb and Arnold Beachman, and so Herb helped get me going on this. So that's it come really full circle, and also to Ken DeGraffenreid, who's not here, but I'm an admirer of his as well. Mac Owens, thank you for all your work and all that you're doing. I remember sitting, one more Bill Clark story, but I remember sitting in the tack barn, as your dad used to call it, right, at the ranch in Shandon, Paso Robles, California, and sitting there looking through all these old documents that if any archivist would have seen that these documents were sitting in the tack barn, she would have had a heart attack. But Bill kept everything, and there were these heartfelt letters, personally written longhand by John, by Ken, by Roger Robinson, and a few other of the cadre that Bill called them at the National Security Council, begging and pleading with him not to leave in October 1983. But he did, and Bill was a very religious man, and he believed that the DP, the divine plan, as he and Ronald Reagan called it, called on him at that point. It was okay to leave. He believed that the plan was in. The plan was in process. They had it there. They had laid it out, and they had laid out the plan to prevail and win the Cold War. And looking back in retrospect, he was there just long enough to lay it all out, to put all those NSDDs, 300 some NSDDs in the Reagan administration, and Bill Clark oversaw about 100, 110 of them in the short 2-year period that he was there. NSD 32, 66, 75, all the crucial ones involved in the takedown of the Soviet Union. But I could talk about that all day. I'm here today to talk about Dupes, which is one of my favorite subjects, and I could talk about Dupes for hours and days. So you'll have to probably stop me at some point, as I could go on and on with different examples of this. That final book that I turned in was about 250,000 words. And how many pages did this end up? Over 600 pages, small print. And I used to joke, half-jokingly, that this could be volume 1 in a multi-volume set, which is true. And that's really a sad testimony to the different people who... a dupe is really an innocent. A dupe doesn't intend malicious... it doesn't have malicious intent. A dupe unwittingly aids and abets the enemy. And if you think about it, that's an especially dangerous situation, where you have people aiding and abetting, and in the case of Soviet communism, evil, and they don't even realize that they're doing it. I opened up the book with a quote from Whittaker Chambers in Witness, and the dupes that the communists used were liberals, progressives, people on the left, right? That's who they would go after. That's who was closest to them ideologically. Liberals and progressives weren't communists, but they were on the left, so it's going to be much easier to dupe if you're a communist, a liberal, or a progressive than it is a right-winger, right? But Whittaker Chambers in Witness said, while communists make full use of liberals and their solicitudes, and sometimes flatter them to their faces, in private they treat them with that sneering contempt that the strong and predatory almost invariably feel for the victims who help to volunteer in their own victimization. That's a pretty damning statement. But Whittaker Chambers would know. He knew. So I'm going to give you a few examples today. John Dewey, who was what I called a Potemkin progressive. I'll explain what those are. Margaret Sanger. That'll be fun, right? You guys, some of you happy I picked Margaret Sanger? I mean, I've got hundreds, and this is the 4 or 5 that I came up with. Frank Marshall Davis and Ted Kennedy. In honor of Mac, I had to pick Ted Kennedy. And also, too, I'll conclude if I have time, if you don't throw me out by then, by giving an example from the theme of my new book, which is it's called Takedown, and it's on how the communist left and the left generally has slowly but surely sought to undermine family and marriage. So a nice neutral, non-incendiary topic there that's winning me, getting a lot of new friends and winning me a lot of kind emails. But so to start, this term dupe, where does this come from? And it was hard doing a book called Dupes because people think that that's name calling, right? And I teach at a Christian college, and as a Christian, I'm supposed to be charitable, and I try to, right? It's one of the things I always work on. And so to give a book the title Dupes, it seems like you're calling people names, but in fact, that's a term that was very common during the Cold War, and that communists used all the time to refer to the people that they were duping, hoodwinking, suckering is another term that was used. So it's very common during that time. A lot of people don't realize that term goes back much, much further. In George Washington's farewell address, he warns of dupes. So the father of our country actually used the term dupes. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations used the word dupes. And in fact, there's even in some translations of Scripture, the word duped or duped appears. In fact, I believe it's the New American Bible translation. And if you don't actually find that exact word duped, there are phrases over and over again about being fooled, misled, warning people essentially not to be duped, if it doesn't explicitly use that word duped. So, and why did it matter for the Cold War in particular? Because the Soviets were masters at this. They were masters of manipulation, of agitation and propaganda. They really sought out to do this, unlike any other group that I could think of. I mean, men sat around and tried to think of ways to mislead people that were a little bit over to their left, or I guess to be a little over to their right on the spectrum, but still on the left. Willie Munzenberg, who in the massive Appendix 9, 2,100 pages released by Congress a half a century ago, the first name that they come up with is the first name there is Willie Munzenberg, who's referred to as the Henry Ford of organization among the communists. Grigory Zinoviev, first head of the Comintern. Vladimir Lenin used the term useful idiots. There's some debate over what exactly Lenin said there. Probably the most direct Russian translation would translate into deaf mutes. But Lenin said, find these people, use them. As Chambers would say, flatter them to their faces, but really privately treat them with that sneering contempt that these victims don't even realize, these people that don't even realize that they're being used. George Lukács, who was the Hungarian communist, the cultural commissar, under when the communists launched their revolution in the 1910s. He was a master at this. Lukács, through the Marx Engels Institute in 1920, 21, 22, along with Karl Radek and a number of other hardcore communists in the Soviet Union, they eventually founded what became known as the Frankfurt School of Cultural Marxists, an extremely influential group of communists. You guys should do a whole course on the cultural Marxists. You probably do. Another reason why this is a great place. But they have enormous damage the cultural Marxists have wrought on the country through education, sex, and culture. That was their recipe for taking down the West. Not through economics, the classic Marx Engels mold, but through culture. But dupes, why were dupes so important to what the communists wanted to do? In America, the Communist Party, the American Communist Party, never got to be more than about 100,000 members in the 1930s. So if you really wanted influence, you needed a much wider circle of different people to bring in, to try to attract, to try to bring to your cause. People that didn't realize that they were being drawn in and recruited to the cause. So some examples of this. John Dewey and the Potemkin Progressives. I use that term Potemkin Progressives in Dupes. Potemkin villages were what? These were villages in the Soviet Union that were set up for the purpose of misleading or duping Westerners. You take them and you show them this new factory. You show them this new nursery. You show them this new school. And the factory is producing things that would just blow away anything in the imagination of Westerners. But it's a fake. So you would have these fake villages. The North Koreans are notorious for this. The Cubans did it. The communist Chinese under Mao did this. So they would create these Potemkin villages, and these were really pushed in the 1920s and 1930s on American and Western progressives, who kind of, if you really think about it, I mean, a lot of progressivism simply wants an evolution, whereas the communists wanted a revolution. And I'm amazed again and again and again, I'll show you some examples with Margaret Sanger, where progressives are now in 2015 is where Moscow was in like 1925 or 1935. Moscow just wanted to get there right away. For the progressive movement, they never went quite as far to the left, but they would take their time and come to this more slowly. So a lot of progressives in the 1920s and 1930s thought that maybe the Soviets, maybe the Bolsheviks had truly discovered the brave new world, right? Maybe they were doing what we need to do now, and maybe they're just getting there a little closer, a little faster, and let's go over and take a look. So the Soviets welcomed by the literal boatload people, groups of educators, labor union officials from New York, wherever, would take the boat across the water, go into Europe, eventually take trains, get all the way to the Soviet Union. One of them, H.G. Wells, who was not American, of course, right, but British, after meeting Joe Stalin in 1934, said this: "I've never